artificial intelligence will completely transform our world. But what is AI? Why will it affect you? And how can you and your business survive and thrive through the AI revolution? Welcome to AI and You. Here is your host, author, speaker, and futurist, Peter Scott.
Hello, welcome to episode 275. I have been talking with Benedikt Frey, Associate Professor of AI and Work at the Oxford Internet Institute and Director and Founder of the Future of Work program at the Oxford Martin School, both at the University of Oxford, and referred to several times on this podcast as co-author of the 2013 study, The Future of Employment, How Susceptible Are Jobs to Computerization, which has received over 12,000 citations for its conclusion that nearly half of all jobs are at risk from automation. He is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, and in 2019 he joined the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on the New Economic Agenda, as well as the Bretton Woods Committee. His 2019 book, The Technology Trap: Capital, Labor, and Power in the Age of Automation, was selected a Financial Times Best Book of the Year and awarded Princeton University's Richard A. Lester Prize. Between 2020 and 2022, he was a member of the Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence, hosted by the OECD. We have been talking about his new book, published last week if you're listening to us on release, called How Progress Ends: Technology, Innovation, and the Fate of Nations. Last week, we talked about whether progress is inevitable, how growth depends on the interplay of technology and institutions, the link between productivity and innovation, the importance of institutional flexibility and decentralized funding, the effects of tariffs, the risks of China's increasingly centralized model, and why both countries are triggering declining dynamism in each other. This week, we'll talk about the links between innovation and industry productivity, why AI hasn't yet delivered broad gains, automation's uneven effects on workers, the role of antitrust in sustaining competition, and the need for institutions like Oxford to adapt. Let's get back into the interview with Benedikt Frey. Wow. You mentioned stagnation earlier, and that comes in for a lot of attention in your book. And I'm wondering if you can unpack for us the relationship between economic stagnation and innovation. Does innovation get us out of economic stagnation, or are those not as tethered together as we would like?
Yeah, so for economic growth over the long run, you need technological change. You need to create new industries, new activities for labor. So you can think about it this way. If all we've done since 1800 was automation, you would have productive agriculture and cheap textiles, but you would not have much else. You wouldn't have vaccines, antibiotics, computers, airplanes, etc., right? And so to create those new industries, those new activities, you need to explore new things. But when you explore, you devote away resources from production, right? So you're essentially reducing productivity in the short term to climb to a higher technological plateau in the long run, right? And you need both. You need to do the exploration, you need to devote those resources to conceiving new things, and then you need to create the institutions that allow those industries to scale and become large. And so 20th century, early 20th century Detroit had much in common with Silicon Valley. There was a lot of car companies there that shared technology, shared ideas. Henry Ford's Ford Motor Company emerged on top. And when they decided to scale, they moved production out of the city where it was cheaper to produce. And then you needed a host of institutions to support scaling in logistics. You needed railroads, highways to support scaling operations. You needed educational institutions to build up a skilled white-collar workforce to manage the enterprise. But obviously, at some point, the car industry running into diminishing returns. There are only so many cars that people want to own. They're not getting that much better any longer compared to the early days. And so we need to conceive something new to get to a higher technological plateau, and that requires exploration.
And at the moment, AI seems to be the actor that's jumped in to take that role. But you pointed out that the productivity figures have still remained in the doldrums for decades. Why, with all of this rapid innovation, especially in AI, has that not percolated down to increase in productivity?
So I think AI is still in its early days, and I think we will probably need some technological breakthroughs to be able to fully release the productivity gains from that. So if you take the steam engine in its early days, it was only used to drain coal mines, and even that it didn't do particularly well. It was tremendously energy inefficient, and it took James Watt's separate condenser to make it energy efficient, to apply it to factories, and then further improvements and tweaks by others to apply it to railroads and steamships. And you only really see the productivity gains once these new industries around railroads, for example, appear. Just automating existing work don't give you that much productivity improvement, it turns out. AI today has not had its separate condenser moment yet. It requires vast data sets for learning. And even then, the world is constantly changing, right? So if the world was just a static distribution of events, you could probably brute force your way to superintelligence just by increasing the size of these models, more data, more parameters, more compute, right? And then you covered every case there is, and you're done, right? But the world is changing all the time. And so an AI algorithm that performs well today might not perform well tomorrow because other things have changed. So to give you an example, most people have heard of AlphaGo, which beat the world champion in Go back in 2016. Fewer people have probably heard that human amateurs using basic laptops beat the best Go programs quite easily back in 2023 by exposing them to positions that they had previously not encountered in a training. And what that means is that even in a domain where you already achieved superhuman performance, you can't be sure how well the technology actually performs when circumstances change. So AI today has a real resilience problem. And that means that for the most part, as long as we have that, you will still need a human in the loop. And it can be a useful productivity tool, just like a calculator is a useful productivity tool. But to be fair, you can apply AI to a wider range of domains. But unless we use AI to create new industries and activities, we're not going to see an either particularly large or sustained upsurge in productivity growth. And so we now need to ask ourselves, under which conditions are we most likely to get the innovations that we need in AI? I argue in the book that this will require decentralized exploration, and open source is probably the way to go. And I think DeepSeek underlines that. And secondly, we need to think about market concentration in the industries that are actually using AI, right? Because large firms that have scale, they're more likely to use AI for automation and to bring products and services they already do to the market at lower cost. New firms are more likely to use it to develop new products in industries. And if you have a situation where you have fewer firms, new firms entering, and fewer new firms scaling, then that's a challenge. In fact, if you look at the largest 5 firms by market cap in the United States, they are around 39 years old and all are in tech. If you do the same thing in Germany, they're 100 years plus old and they are in the industries of the second industrial revolution. And in France, they're mostly luxury goods. And all in Europe, these firms are generally quite old. So America is actually an outlier when it comes to dynamism And it's one of the reasons that American industry has been so successful over time in terms of its capacity to renew itself. But in recent years, we've seen that dynamism fading, and we see that the startups that actually are set up, they grow less rapidly in the past. We also see that more inventive talent is clustering among incumbents. And so I'm happy to admit that we see innovation coming out from Google and from Microsoft and from Amazon. But it's not very surprising that you see that given the amount of talent they employ. And so the counterfactual question is, what would it look like if those people had worked for smaller firms and be given greater autonomy? And we have research to show that they're more productive in smaller firms.
Mentioning their Microsoft and the amount of talent they employ, that's by a recent report, 9,000 fewer talent than they had before that. That's one of the layoff statistics that's now growing as we get reports of companies nakedly replacing their human workers with AI. When AI first was hitting the news in a big way, they were saying, no, we're not going to reduce employment, but now that has shifted. And one could certainly look at that and say that this is the fulfillment of predictions made by earlier papers between you and Michael Osborne about the future of employment and susceptibility to automation. Do you feel that this is bearing out what you had said in that work, or is it too early to say?
I think it's too early to say. So to be clear, I don't have any insider insights to decisions at Microsoft and these companies when it comes to some of these layoffs, right? So probably partly AI as a productivity tool, probably partly restructuring of the business around the fact that AI doesn't just allow you to automate some tasks, but change where the business should focus its investments more broadly. And I think it's also probably the case that some of these activities are going to shift offshore as a consequence. So if you take a Google engineer in the Bay Area, he or she earns a 6-digit salary. In Manila, the same Google employee earns an order of magnitude less. One thing we know from a variety of experimental studies is that AI benefits novices and low-skilled workers more. So, Dostoevsky's novels would probably not have been any more interesting and probably less interesting if he had access to generative AI, whereas an academic that can't write benefits disproportionately from large language models. And so I would predict that we're going to see AI reducing the productivity differentials between those workers in the Bay Area and Manila, and that firms will benefit from lower costs in the Philippines, will start shifting more workers over there. To what degree we're already seeing that, I don't know, but I think that's the way to think about generative AI at the moment. In our 2013 paper, we were looking more at automation broadly, and so AI was a part of that. And we were looking more at occupations that are likely to be outright automated. So we're thinking, forklift drivers, autonomous cargo trucks, etc. And we're seeing some of that bear out. We're seeing, for example, translators being automated through machine translation already. We also see that some of the occupations we predicted would be susceptible to automation back in 2013, such as fashion models, are now actually automatable with generative AI. So yeah, I think some of these trends speak to the work that we published back in 2013. Some things like driverless vehicles, for example, have taken longer time than we had anticipated back then. But I think we're seeing real progress there as well at the moment, and we're likely to see many more jobs in transportation, in logistics, in warehouses being automated in the near future.
We've discussed a number of race to the bottom dynamics here that is part of that tension between capitalism and democracy. that seems to have tilted more in the direction of unfettered capitalist outreach lately and has resulted in, for instance, nosebleed levels of ratio of CEO to worker pay. And that's invited comparisons with the Gilded Age and the robber barons. How justified do you feel those comparisons are, and what can we learn from that period of history?
So first of all, unfettered capitalism is not a term that I found helpful and intuitive. And so to me, we have a lack of competition, not too much competition. And part of that, you could argue, is because firms are erecting barriers to entry, they're investing more in lobbying, and as a consequence, it's harder for competitors to enter the market. So, it's a different kind of capture dynamic. And I think it has parallels, certainly, to the Gilded Age, right? And during the Gilded Age, we saw the Pendleton Act emerge, which created meritocratic civil service. We saw the Sherman Antitrust Act emerge to deal with rent-seeking and high levels of market concentration. The United States, I think, arrived at the right balance, whereby it was fine for a firm to be large and grow and scale as long as it didn't behave anti-competitively. And I think that is the lesson that needs to be applied today. We don't want to politicize antitrust to a degree that you can just pursue a case against a firm because you don't like it politically for some reasons. I'm not a huge defender of the consumer welfare standard by any means, but at least it is a standard. And so we need to look at these things in a rules-based matter. It is certainly true that antitrust enforcement receded after the case against Microsoft. It's now become more in vogue again, but it's also true that the Biden administration, which restarted antitrust, if you like, lost a higher proportion of the cases launched than previous administrations. But I think it's absolutely clear that, competition policy in the US has been a key driver of progress, right? So the case against IBM, for example, forced it to unbundle hardware and software, open up the space for Microsoft and other firms to enter the market. Similarly, the breakup of AT&T meant that when the National Science Foundation released ARPANET to the world, it couldn't be bottlenecked in the boardroom of AT&T, but was handed out in a manner that meant that a number of players can develop the modern internet organically. And so I think those competition cases have been very important to the rise of American software and to the rise of American e-commerce. And, the lessons from the Gilded Age, I think, are relevant today as well. But antitrust needs to be rules-based, not based on political factors.
Thank you. To take this in a different direction as we come to a close here, you're talking to us from Oxford University, which is one of the oldest, most distinguished and long-lived institutions in the world. It deserves a place in the pantheon of institutions that you've been talking about for that alone, for the impact that it, and forced to mention, of course, Cambridge here as my alma mater in that respect, and other universities of similar standing. And that bespeaks for their ability to withstand the slings and arrows of fortune that are going on in the world around them, to last nearly 1,000 years so far through that. Some level of competence with respect to foresight and adaptation. And now here we are in an era that's widely described as the fastest amount of change in history, and that will only accelerate from here. So from your perspective inside the university, teaching and researching. How do you see the forces of this change affecting the university, an institution of that level of ability and longevity, reacting to these, both in how it preserves its character and how it adjusts its teaching?
So I think the first thing to say is it's important not to be complacent, right? So the University of Berlin was once the leading research university of the world. German universities were world leading. American research universities are world leading today. It seems that that could change too, given the current policy environment. And, even though Oxford might get some new talent as a consequence of that, we shouldn't be complacent. I think what Oxford and Cambridge has going for it, which will still be relevant for the foreseeable future, is the tutorial system, whereby we teach students in smaller groups, write essays, discuss, and debate. I think as more and more correspondence virtually will be done with AI, and as we see the outputs these foundational models are producing is becoming more and more similar, how do you distinguish yourself in such a world? Well, it's going to be through in-person communication and through discussion, through debate and social engagement. And, I think the tutorial system is good for developing those types of skills. I think it's also good for developing writing skills, which I hope we will continue to foster, because writing is absolutely critical to learning. And if you begin to outsource writing entirely to AI, we're also going to lose something very fundamental and important to the learning process. That said, we should also not be technologically backward, and we should allow students to take advantage of new productivity tools that they will have to their disposal also later in life when they come out of university. I think many educational institutions around the world have struggled with policies around AI. They keep changing. There are a lot of people with different opinions. But, Oxford is a reasonably decentralized place with its college system, with its departmental system. And, I'm quite optimistic that that will lead to a wide range of experiments. And hopefully, we will then be able to take the successes and then scale them across the university. So I think that Oxford has some good preconditions, but there's no way of getting around the fact that if all that you want to achieve is learning stuff, is getting information, then, there's a lot of alternatives out there already. AI is already a pretty good tutor across a number of domains, but institutions, I still think, have an important role for creating some of the conditions in which learning can thrive.
That's an excellent note to end on. So your book, How Progress Ends, Technology, Innovation, and the Fate of Nations. When people pick this up, what is the frame of mind and what do you want them to keep in mind as they go through this immense exploration of what brought us to where we are now?
I want them to realize that progress is fragile. I want them to realize that it's not a given, it's not natural. And we as a society need to come together and decide that it's something that we want to pursue. We need people to mobilize for competition, not against competition. And that's not always something that's easy to achieve.
Wonderful. Carl Frey, thank you so much for not just this conversation, but everything you've done to make such an important difference in the world in the way that we think about and prepare for the changes that seem both inevitable and inscrutable, and that has made a big difference to me personally and to so many people around the world.
Thank you very much, Peter. It's been a real pleasure to be with you, and thank you for challenging me and for some very good questions indeed. Thank you.
We do our best. And that's the end of the interview. That conversation really elevated my thinking to an incredibly high level of spatial, or geographical, and temporal, or historical, awareness of the context in which the impacts of AI are occurring today. In today's news ripped from the headlines about AI, researchers at the UK AI Security Institute, the University of Oxford, the London School of Economics and Political Science, Stanford University, and MIT published a study under the title The Levers of Political Persuasion with Conversational AI. They begin their abstract with the sentence, "There are widespread fears that conversational AI could soon exert unprecedented influence over human beliefs," and then went on to demonstrate how well-founded those fears are. They conducted 3 experiments involving over 75,000 participants and found that top AI chatbots can sway political opinions in under 10 minutes, and 36 to 42% of those shifts persisted a month later. They showed that, quote, "The persuasive power of current and near-future AI is likely to stem more from post-training and prompting methods, which boosted persuasiveness by as much as 51% and 27% respectively, than from personalization or increasing model scale." End quote. They received informed consent from all participants, and the conversations that the bots participated in were on topics central to UK political debate: economy and jobs, healthcare, education, foreign policy, national security and defense, immigration, and climate change and environment. You know, exactly the topics on which people on the internet have the most agreement and harmony in discussing. I'd say that these conclusions are deeply concerning for the future of democracies that enshrine freedom of speech when they can demonstrably be swayed by bad actors. Next week, my guest will be Professor Michael Gerlich, head of the Center for Strategic Corporate Foresight and Sustainability at the Swiss Business School, talking about his research showing that use of AI had negative impacts on critical thinking. That's next week on AI and You. Until then, remember, no matter how much computers learn how to do, it's how we come together as humans that matters.
That's all for this episode of AI and You. Please leave a rating and comment and share with your friends. Get the book Artificial Intelligence and You and see more videos and articles at aiandyou.net. That's aiandyou.net, where you can also send us your questions. Thank you for listening.